Tangier again. After having introduced herself, now we ask Princess Ruspoli to introduce her historical approach.
So I began to study, and I began to realize that there were the main differences between people were the differences of religion, that the religions built a wall around people. If it had been that way always, well, that meant that when the Greeks, who are our first historians, wrote, for instance, the history of the Egyptians, that they might have been wrong, because there was a religious wall between them and ancient Egypt. The Egyptians didn't speak for themselves, because when the Greeks wrote about them, the hieroglyphs were hardly read, and the Egyptians had been conquered, and they had very little to say. I found that this wall did exist, and that the Greeks had understood nothing at all. If they had understood nothing at all, it meant that there was perhaps something that might be found by studying the Egyptian texts. It was then that a friend gave me the Egyptian Book of the Dead, which is a collection of papyri. Papyri are pergamena, or this paper that was made out of reeds in Egypt, and that were put in the tombs. They were supposed to help the dead on their journey towards the land of their ancestors. What was the land of their ancestors? Why did they have a land of the ancestors? And why did they have to go back to the land of the ancestors? Well, the hymns to the sun gave me an answer to that question. I read them over and over again and couldn't understand them at all, until I came upon one small sentence. It was addressing the sun, "Thou comest forth from the waters." Well, I said to myself, if I am an Egyptian standing with my 2 feet on Egyptian soil, and if I watch the sun rise, and if I see the sun rise out of the waters, these waters can only be the Red Sea, which begins at the Suez Canal, or the Indian Ocean, which begins at Aden. That is the whole length of Egypt. And the souls of the east welcomed the sun, and the souls of the west awaited him. Therefore it went on, since it was going on towards the souls of the west that were waiting. Thereupon the sun left Egypt and began to go over the immense Saharan region, which crosses the whole center of North Africa. This enormous region is described, for instance, there's a moment when there is a land which, instead of welcoming the sun, is sad when the sun rises and welcomes the setting sun. Why? This land is called Narezruft. I said to myself, that is the Tanezruft. It's this hell of heat which is in the Sahara, and which of course welcomes the setting sun, that is, the coming of coolness in the evening. One point after another, the Saharan toponymy, by toponymy we mean the science of names, toponymy, that these names in the Sahara of today were in the Egyptian texts of several thousands of years ago, and that you could trace them. Thereupon, the sun went further. It reached the pillars of the sky. What were these pillars of the sky? They were the highest mountain of North Africa, which is the Atlas. Well, these pillars of the sky, which are in the Egyptian text, are also mentioned by Homer and by Hesiodus. And Hesiodus says, Atlas, who at the end of the world holds up the sky on his mighty arms. And Homer says, Atlas, who contemplates the depths of the ocean. From the Atlas Mountains, the sun gets to the Atlantic Ocean at Tamanu. Tamanu, Ta in Egyptian, means earth. It means the same thing in the Berber language of today, Tamashek, which is spoken from the Atlantic Ocean right across Africa. The Tamashek still says Ta for earth. Well, Tamanu was the land of the setting sun. Thereupon, the sun plunges over the Atlantic Ocean. And then it comes over a region where there are the devourer of fishes, huge fishes. But curiously enough, that region would perhaps coincide with the path of whales, which is still followed by whales nowadays. Beyond that, there is the mountain of fire, which spits fire, and which is 3 times higher than 3 times that the mountain should be coming out of the sea. Well, this mountain could be the tide of the Canary Islands, which is the largest emergent volcano of the Atlantic, and which is the highest peak of the Atlantic. Then the sun goes on and on over regions until suddenly it comes over the region of fire. And that could be a reminiscence of the disappearance of Atlantis in the sea. It says, thy waters are on fire, and the streams within thee burn with fire. No one can come near, and the dead that are beneath the waters, they have died in fear. And there are those terrible descriptions of death in the waters of fire. Well, this led me to think that the country where the Egyptians went back in the west, which they called Amentet, and that Amentet, which was the island of fire, the island from which Horus escaped at the moment of the great inundation, that the inundation of the deluge was contemporary to the sinking of Atlantis in a world of fire of the volcanoes which are along the ocean rift, which has recently been discovered by the American Oceanographic Expedition.
What's the orthodox interpretation of these names, different from your interpretation?
Those names were never interpreted and never brought together with the names of the Egyptian papyri until I did so. There I think I'm certainly the first.
How is it possible that they didn't match them with existing North African names?
They never knew. They always thought that whatever the Egyptians wrote was just fancy.
Mythology.
They didn't, mythology, and they didn't take it to have a real background, which was concrete background and not a background of fantasy.
So your first discovery was that all the mythological names, which they considered mythological names, were real